Okay, today's daf is Shabbat, daf Kuf Lamed Aleph. We have a lot of dedications for today. Today's daf is sponsored by Adana Goldberg and Michael Kelman in celebration of Adana's grandfather, Mayor Weitz's 100th birthday. Mr. Weitz loves studying Talmud and has always been a strong proponent of advancing women's Talmud study. And by Susan Fisher, in memory of her father, Eliezer ben Shraga Farbish Alvais, Zichrono Livracha, on his Yurtzeit. He loved learning and filled her home with Sifrei Kodesh and the books which made Limud Torah a joy. And finally, by Vicky Gordon, in memory of her father, Yisrael Izzy Herzog, Zichrono Livracha, a giant in Chesed. She misses him every day. Okay, with that, we're going to get started on Daf Kuf Lamed Aleph. We have a bunch of charts on today's daf that might help you. Certainly on the second part, there's a nice long chart. We're going to start now just to do a quick review of yesterday, what we saw from the middle of Kuf Lamed Amud Bet. There was a question asked about a mavoy, if you remember, this alleyway that opens up into chatzerot and batim, right, courtyards, which lead to houses. If you didn't do shitufei mavot, and we explained, even though it didn't say it inside, and today we'll see where they get that from, we're talking here about a mavoy that they put up a lechi or a korah, meaning their sign, so to speak, that there was a fourth wall, which generally allows you to carry inside, but they didn't put out the food that's supposed to join everybody together. Can we allow carrying, not, obviously in that case, you can't carry from your house or courtyard to the mavoi, to the alleyway, but you are allowed, the question is, are you allowed to carry in the mavoi itself? Since in the mavoi, let's say there was an item in the mavoi before Shabbat started, maybe you'd be allowed to carry within that mavoi, okay? And that's his question. So Rabbi Zera asked this to Rav Asi doesn't answer. And then Rav Asi on another occasion quotes Rish Lakish, who basically seems to indicate that one can do this. So then Rabbi Zera says, oh, you seem to say this. And then he says, oh yeah, I do hold this way. And he says, why didn't you remember? Why didn't you tell me last time? And there were two explanations of that. Then Rabbi Zera himself, now after that, quotes from Rav. And Rav says the opposite. You can't carry more than 4 amot in that mavoi, even though there's a lechi or a korah, since you didn't do the shitufei mavot and put food out to join all these together, you're not even allowed to carry within the mavoi itself more than 4 amot. 4 amot, as we know from Reshut HaRabim, the public domain, it's considered your own space. That one theoretically could carry within that small space, but it's not more than that. But then they explain, right, if you remember, he said, I didn't really understand this when I heard Rabbi Zera say it until, or was it, right, Abaye says, I didn't really understand this until Rabba Bar Avua came and explained it. And then he explained something which still didn't make sense to us, which is, well, the halacha of Rav that you can only carry within 4 amot in that mavoi depends on whether there was an eruv done for the chatzers, for the courtyards that were in that mavoi or not. And it was a little counterintuitive. If there was an eruv in the courtyards, then you're not allowed to carry in the mavoi more than 4 amot. If there was no eruv, then you can carry. So now we're going to have to explain why that is. So he says, what's the difference? So Rav Chanina from Choza'ah says to Rabba, what's the reason why? Okay, now he's basically going to say, I'm going to tell you the reason. But if that's the case, it would also extend to the second case. Now, again, we have 2 cases, one where they didn't do an eruv and one where they did do an eruv. So he says, when they did the eruv in the chatzerot, I understand why. What basically happens when we make an eruv in this courtyard? What we're basically saying is all the members of these houses that live together, basically all of them are like one big family. Okay, we're one house. So if we say this mavoi now, instead of having houses and courtyards open to the mavoi, what they basically have is a house, and let's say there's 3 courtyards, and each courtyard did an eruv. So now instead of having each chatzer, let's say, has 3 houses open to the courtyard, and then those 3 courtyards open up into the mavoi, you basically have, in essence, 3 houses, because each chatzer becomes a house, 1 unit. What's the issue? So what? Who cares? Well, Rav l'ta'ameh. Okay, so he says, Kirvu chatzeron batim dinit ku chatzerot v'nasu batim. We basically are uprooting the courtyards. There are no courtyards anymore. Each courtyard becomes a house. The Rav l'ta'ameh, and Rav goes according to his approach. Rav said in a different place, Ein hamavoy nitar belechi bekorah. Here we see A lechi, this is where we know that we're talking about a case where there's a lechi and a koha. The mavoi, the lechi and the koha only help in which case? Ad shihu batim v'chatzerot ptuchim letocho. Only if you have houses and courtyards leading into the alley. But here we don't have houses and courtyards. Here we have only houses, basically, because the courtyards became houses. Now, why is this a criteria? Why do you need, in order to say this third, what happens in a mavoi? We have 3 mechitzot generally, and 3 walls. It's surrounded by walls on 3 sides, but the 4th side is open to the public domain. In order to allow it, what do we put up? Either a beam standing vertically or a beam going across horizontally. That works. Now, what's the option? If not that, we can make more of a wall. That basically functions as our fourth wall. If a lechi or korah doesn't work, what might you need? You might need what we call tzurat petach, which is a hole, like a 2 standing and 1 going vertically, or maybe 2 lechis, 1 on each side. In other words, a lechi and a korah are not enough. You need more. Why do you need more if there's houses open up to it and not houses and courtyards, or the reverse, right? You need both houses and courtyards. What's the reason? So if you think about it, what allows us to carry in our houses on Shabbat? The fact that we're in a private domain. What makes our house a private domain? Well, generally, it's because we have walls up. We have 4 walls on our houses. Nobody lives in generally, we don't live in a house that's totally open on one side. And that's because a house is meant for private use, and private use needs privacy. So basically, we have walls. Now, if the alleyway doesn't need 4 walls, why not? Because the alleyway is not a private space. The alleyway is a public space. People, if you're going to walk out, you wouldn't walk out into the alleyway the same way you walk out in your house, right? In your house, you walk around however you want. But when you go into the alleyway, you know there's going to be lots of people around, and you're going to watch the way you walk out, and you're not looking for privacy there. But if the mavoi leads only to a few houses and not, or the houses lead to this alley and not houses and courtyards, then it's a more private space. The more private it is, the more walls it needs in order to allow carrying inside of it. So since this ends up being a more private space, if you only have houses open to it, then basically we're going to say 3 walls with a little beam going one direction or the other is not going to be sufficient for a wall here because it's a more private alley. So now they say, well, that fits with our logic now. If you do an eruv in each courtyard, and let's say you have 3 courtyards, but really in essence, those courtyards turn into houses. And it's like you have only 3 houses open into this alley, in which case it's more private, in which case your lechi and korah are not going to be enough. And that's why Rav says you can only carry within 4 amot, okay? And you can't carry in that mavoi. But if that's the case, he says, okay, so that's the logic for the first. But then he says, kilo irvunami. But then the logic should apply also if you don't do an eruv. Why? If you have houses open to a courtyard and you can't carry from your house to the courtyard, and you can't carry from your courtyard to your mavoi because it doesn't have the eruv chatzerot, and it doesn't have a shitufei mavot, which is what you need for the alley. So basically, the house isn't really considered that the house opens into the mavoi because the house is kind of blocked by the courtyard. So it's not really like the house opens up into the mavoi. So in essence, in that case, it's the reverse, where you have courtyards, but you don't really have houses because the houses don't really open up to the mavoi because you can't take anything from the house into the mavoi. So therefore, they say, well, theoretically, and basically the batim, you don't really have houses because you can't carry from the house into the courtyard. So they say, well, let's give you a case where theoretically there could be no eruv, and yet the houses wouldn't be kind of blocked. You'd be able to carry from the houses to the courtyards, in which case it would be like houses and courtyards are open to the alley. What would be that case? And this is an interesting halacha. If you forgot to do an eruv chatzerot before Shabbat, there's a solution on Shabbat that you can do. If you want to carry not in your mavoi, but in your chatzer. Okay, so again, we have 3 houses that open up. This happens, I live in Ranana. This happens in Ranana, actually, where there's often a long driveway that leads to 3 different houses or something like that. There's back houses, and they all kind of open up into a common area that really only they walk in. It's not like it's closed to the public, but only they walk in, although maybe halachically you would need it really closed in. But anyway, try to imagine something like that. So what do they say? Well, efshar dimivat lele reshuta dekulu legabe echad. If it turns out Shabbat comes in and we all realize we forgot to make a mavoi, we want to be eruv chatzera, and we want to be able to carry within our courtyard. So what do? We all say to the other, we go and we say, listen, I'm going to give up my house to you this Shabbat. And we all go to one of the people that live there and say, you can own my house for Shabbat, basically. Now, what's interesting is Beit Shammai says you can't do this. That's kind of like a kinyan, right? You're basically giving someone rights to your house, and that's kind of like selling. So Beit Shammai doesn't allow this, but Beit Hillel says, no, it's not a problem, because you're really just giving up rights. You're not actually handing them over to someone else. You're just saying, I'm giving up rights to my house, in which case there's going to be one person in the chatzer that can have access to all the houses, because everyone's given up their rights to him. He's the only one who hasn't given up his rights, so he's the only one who can access everything. And then it's considered like it belongs to one person. And that would allow carrying within the chatzer. If it allows carrying within the chatzer, there's no longer this barrier that we were concerned with between the house to the mavoi. Because theoretically now you can get from the house to the chatzer, so it's like the house is open to the public. However, the Gemara rejects this and says, what do you mean? So buy it ika batim leika. But didn't he say, Rav said you need houses and courtyards. In this case, it's only like there's really one house open because it's all owned by one person. Again, that whole courtyard is owned by one person. So again, you're stuck with not really having houses here. You're missing something that's necessary for Rav to say this is a more public space, which means the lechi and kolah are enough. So they say, okay, well, let's give this example. Maybe it's a case where they said in the morning, you have rights, right? We're all giving up our rights for the morning hours to you. And in the afternoon, we're all giving up our rights to me. Okay, so basically for the morning, you're in charge, and for the afternoon, I'm in charge, which means we could say theoretically there's batim open because there's two different owners. But the Gemara doesn't like that either, because at every given moment, there's still only one owner, right, of that courtyard. It's either you in the morning or me in the afternoon. So that's not going to resolve it, because we want at every given point there to be houses open, and there aren't houses. So basically they reject this whole option. So everything we learned until now is rejected. That's not what Rav was trying to say, or the reason why Rav said it. Ela Amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi has a different explanation. He says, Mi garam lechatzerot she'asru batim v'leika. He says like this, okay? Now, you need some background to understand. We already started yesterday with Rabbi Shimon. Remember Rabbi Shimon in Eruvin, who says that you're allowed to carry from a courtyard to courtyard, or from a roof to a roof, or from a karpaf to a karpaf, right? An area that's surrounded but not for the purposes of living. All those areas are not common that people dwell in them, right, or spend long time in them, and therefore you're allowed to carry from one to the other. The whole gzerah that the rabbi said you can't carry from private domain to private domain is private domain like a house, but not like one of these other spaces. Now Rashi says that the assumption is that he would say the same thing for alleys, that one could carry from alley to alley. Now, what's the issue though? Why can't you carry in this alley then, or from this alley? And if you remember, Rabbi Shimon said you could carry from the Gag to the Chatzer, from the Chatzer to the Mavoi. In other words, all these spaces you can carry from one to the other. However, they forbade carrying from the Chatzer to the Mavoi, for example. Why? Because what were they worried? They were worried, now in which case, they're worried maybe you'll take something from your house, bring it into your courtyard, and from your courtyard, you'll carry it into the mavoi. If we allow carrying from the courtyard to the mavoi, then to the alley, then you might end up carrying from your house to the mavoi. That you can't do. Now, why would you end up doing that? Remember, the only things that Rabbi Shimon said you could carry from chatzer to chatzer, gag to gag, roof to roof, is only if it was in that space before Shabbat. But if it wasn't in that space before Shabbat, then you can't carry it. If it was in the house, you can't go from the house to the roof, from the roof to the roof, from the roof to the house. You can't do that, right? From one rooftop to another. That obviously is forbidden. So therefore, now it makes perfect sense why there's a difference if there's an Eruv or there's not an Eruv. If you made it Eruv Chatzerot, then what happens? The houses you can carry from the house to the Chatzer. In that case, we don't allow you to carry in the Mavoi at all, because we're worried, or more than 4 amot, because we're worried if we allow carrying the mavoi, you might end up taking something from your, and since carrying is allowed from the courtyard to the mavoi, you might think that you could carry something from your house to the courtyard and from the courtyard to the mavoi. So therefore, in a case where there's an eruv and things can basically make their way out of the house into the courtyard, then we're going to be stringent and we're going to say you can't carry in that mavoi at all because you can't move from the chatzer to the mavoi, you can't carry within the mavoi. We're basically going to forbid everything just in case you might end up with something that maybe you don't even remember that it was in the house when Shabbat started. Once it goes into the chatzer, you'll think it's okay and you'll move it. So therefore, that's only going to be in a case where you could carry out of your house to the courtyard if there's an eruv. If there's no eruv, then you can't carry from your house to the chatzer. In which case, we're not worried that some item from your house is going to end up in the mavoi. In which case, we allow you to carry in the mavoi for more than 4 amot. So that's the reason why there's a distinction, eruv, not eruv, and we've concluded that. Amar Rabbi Zera Ba'aba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. That was the hard part of today's stuff. The rest of this is fairly simple. Rabbi Zera now says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, I read the wrong name. Rabbi Chia Bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. We're now back to Rabbi Eliezer, who allows machshirei milah. Remember, what does that mean? If you need to make a knife, a scalpel, to do the brit milah, you're allowed to chop down trees, light a fire. All that is allowed for the sake of the mitzvah of brit milah. And remember, he said because of chibuvei mitzvah, we love mitzvah. So now the question is going to be, does this apply to all mitzvot? Does he say this is true for all mitzvot? And if he doesn't, where does he draw the line? And that's basically what we're going to deal with for the rest of today. So he now says, according to Rabbi Yochanan, lo lakol amar Rabbi Eliezer machshirei milah dochin et haShabbat, machshirei mitzvah, dochin et haShabbat. He doesn't say it for all mitzvot. How do we know that he doesn't say it for all mitzvot? First, we're going to say, how does he know? Then we're going to say, to which mitzvot doesn't he say it? So, lo lakol, how do we know? Shaharei shtei halechem chovat hayonhem. Shtei halechem are the parts, we bring these breads with the korban on Shavuot. There's a korban that we bring, the sirei kivsei atzeret. With those kvasim, you bring these 2 loaves of bread. It's one of the only times, that and the lechem toda are the only times that you bring actual chametz into the mikdash. It's actually bread, leavened bread. Otherwise, it's all matzah. So, how do we know that shtei halechem? Okay, machshirei. Sorry, I lost my place. Okay, minayin lemachshirei shtei halechem shedochin et haShabbat. How do you know that these push off the Shabbat? That make basically you can do any preparation to prepare these. You can cut the grains, you can prepare the flour, you can cook them, bake them, anything. If Shavuot comes out on Shabbat, because ne'emra hava'a ba'omer v'ne'emra hava'a b'shtei halechem. This is what we call gzera shava. The same word appears there, and the same word appears by the korban omer. Ma hava'a amura ba'omer machshirin dochin et haShabbat. Af hava'a amura b'shtei halechem machshirin dochin et haShabbat. Okay, what does this mean? We really have to start from square A, which they don't even tell us. Omer, the korban omer that we bring, there's a special mincha offering that you bring with the omer, right, that we do on the day after the first day of Pesach, Shabbat, right, the whole machloket about when that is. Anyway, it says in a pasuk, b'charitzu b'kasir tishbot. Now, what does that mean? It means you can't do charishan, you can't do ksira on Shabbat, but we know that because it's part of the lamatet melachot. Why does it specifically say that? So they learn that there must be something, there's a way, what they're trying to say is, b'charitzu b'kasir tishbot, there's a way, charish there's no charisha of a mitzvah, so it must be that the ksira of reshut is forbidden, but they learn from there the ksira of mitzvah is going to be allowed. When is that? The ksirat ha'omer. Okay, so from there they learn you can cut the omer, and the assumption from there is also the machshirim. Okay, right? Because the ksira itself is a machshirei mitzvah, right? It's only to allow the sacrifice of it. The sacrifice of it, of course, is allowed, but this is coming to teach you even to cut it is allowed. So therefore, from there we learn the omer. That's what they don't tell you in the Gemara. Once we have the omer, we learn from there by gzera shava. It says, we bring it, the word to bring. And then it says, mimoshvotechem taviu lechem. By the shtei lechem, it says taviu. The same word is used, so we learn from one to the other. Okay? Gzera shava. What does this have to do with our topic? Because if Rabbi Eliezer learns it out from a special drasha of gzera shava, that means it wasn't obvious to him. If you learn it out from a drasha, that means if there wasn't a drasha, you wouldn't be able to learn it. Now, if he holds any machshirei mitzvah, any preparations for a mitzvah are allowed on Shabbat, you would not need this gzera shava. Okay, and that's how we learn. Now we're going to delve a little more in depth into the gzera shava. The Gemara tells us now, mufne. Okay, there's different types of gzera shava. We take words that appear in two different places, and we learn from one to the other. But there's times when the word is necessary in the pasuk, and we're learning from it not only what it's there for, but also something additional. We're going to learn gzera shava. That's called not mufne. It means the word isn't free to be darshan. We're going to darshan it anyway. But if we have a question on that, we can knock out the gzera shava. In other words, if there's any logical reason to say this gzera shava shouldn't work, then we can knock it out. But if the word is available, so to speak, meaning you don't need the word there for the pasuk itself. You could read the pasuk without that word, and yet it's there. Then that means it's there specifically for the gzera shava. And even if you have a logical argument against the gzera shava stands. However, it depends, is it free on both sides? Remember, there's two psukim, you're learning from one to the other. Does it have to be free on both sides or just on one to say we can't ask a question? So the Gemara starts off and says, it must be this gzera shava is mufne. It must be the word is unnecessary in the verse. De'ilo mufne, because if it wasn't unnecessary, ika lemifrach, we could knock this gzera shava out. How so? Mala omer shekenim matzah katzur kotzel. There's a special mitzvah, it says in the Torah, you have to cut the omer. That means if you find, it's taken from barley, the new crop of the barley, if you find some barley already cut in the fields, you can't take that. You have to cut fresh barley specifically for the mitzvah. But tomar b'shtei alechem, she matzah katzur no kotzer. But if you have wheat already cut and you want to prepare for that, the shtei alechem korban, you're allowed to. So here you see there's a special chumrah, special stringency that applies to omer, which doesn't apply by shtei alechem, which would mean that if the gzera shava wasn't free, we'd be able to knock out the kal v'chomer. Okay, this is a logic that you have to understand for the rest of today's daf, which is if there's some special stringency, then you can't learn from there to something else. So therefore, they say, yeah, lai afnuye mufne. It actually is available, the verse. How do we know? Meaning, there's a word, the word is not necessary for the pshat. You could get rid of that word and everything would read totally fine. Because michtichti veheveitem et omer rishit k'tzirchem ala kohen. B'yom aviachem lamali. The word, the root havi that we're learning it from, to bring, appears twice. It says you should bring the omer, your first of your reapings, to the kohen. And then it says b'yom aviachem. And on the day that you bring it, then continues. Now, the day that you bring it, you don't need to say. You already said you have to bring it. So you could just say, and the day of the Omer, not the day that you bring the Omer. That would be obvious. So therefore, at least on the Omer side, it's extra. So then they say, Shma mina lafnuye. So there you see, it's unnecessary in the verse, and that's why we can't knock out the gzera shava. But the Gemara says, Ba'akate mufne mitzad echadu. But this is only showing availability on one side. And who's our author of all of this? Rabbi Eliezer. Well, Shamina Leila Rabbi Eliezer, even though there's a machloket about this, Rabbi Eliezer sides on the side that says, Ta'amar, mufni mitzad echad lemedim u'meshivim. If you have it available only on one side, you can learn the gzera shava, but meshivim means someone can question it. And if there's a question, it can be knocked out. So therefore, we have to show that it's also available, the taviu pasuk is available on the other side. So now they say, taviu ribuyahi. Oh, in fact, it is available also on the shtei alechem side. Why? Here they don't exactly explain, but it says there, the idea of haviu is mimoshvotechem taviu lechem tnufa, taviu, where? To the Beit HaMikdash. If you're bringing something, it's the same idea as the word takrivu, to sacrifice, right? You're bringing a mincha meal offering. So it says elsewhere, v'hikravtem mincha chadasha laHashem. You should sacrifice a new mincha to God on Shavuot. So once it says v'hikravtem, you don't need taviu. It's obvious that taviu, first of all, the root, you always think of korban as sacrifice, but the root, likarev, is to bring closer, right? So it's also to bring, okay? So lakriv comes from to bring, and therefore we're basically saying that word is also extra. That's why we can't knock out this gzera shava. Really, we could have knocked out if we didn't have these two free verses, but both verses are actually free and available, and that's why Rabbi Eliezer can do this gzera shava. That was all an aside to our main point, which was, again, where did we start? Rabbi Eliezer says, all machshirei milah dochim et haShabbat. You can do any preparation for brit milah on Shabbat. Then we said he doesn't obviously hold this across the board because when it comes to the Shtei HaLechem, he learns it from the Omer, which means that it's true for the Omer, it's true for the Shtei HaLechem, but they each had to be learned from their own special drasha. If we just had this concept that applies across the board, then it would apply across the board. You wouldn't need a special drasha in each case. Now the Gemara wants to focus on the other part of what he said. And the other part of what he said was, well, it applies in certain cases, but it doesn't apply across the board. So where doesn't it apply? In which case doesn't Rabbi Eliezer think that, where does he think that you cannot do preparations on Shabbat for a mitzvah? So we're going to go through a whole list. If it's to say you can't prepare things for the lulav, okay, let's say cut it off the tree if you need a lulav for Shabbat. Before we even continue, we have to go, wait a minute, we don't take a lulav on Shabbat. Well, there's two things we're going to learn. Lulav and shofar, we're going to get much more in depth when we get into them in Masechet Sukkah, and it comes up in Megillah also, because Megillah is one of these three cases where they actually did do it on Shabbat, specifically when the first day, because it says, right? We take lulav on all 7 days. But in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, they only did that in the Beit HaMikdash. Outside the Beit HaMikdash, they only took it on the first day. Then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai came and said, oh, well, now that there's no more Beit HaMikdash, we're going to take it 7 days everywhere. But the real mitzvah is on the first day, and if the first day comes out on Shabbat, in that time period, they did take the lulav, even on Shabbat. What happened? Rabbah made a gzera. He said, we're worried people are going to carry it for Amod and Rishut HaRabim, and he didn't want to allow it. And from there, we stopped it, okay? Also by shofar. We're worried someone might take the shofar to practice, and also by Megillah, okay? Also, we're worried someone's going to practice with it. So therefore, we're no longer allowed to carry them in Rishut HaRabim. There's a whole movement nowadays with shofar. It has to do with the Beit Din. If there's a Beit Din, then we know people won't carry because there's a whole why we make a distinction lulav and shofar, but shofar is something we do publicly for everybody. Lulav is individual. So the Beit Din can basically monitor, make sure people don't do it for shofar, because shofar is more of a public mitzvah, whereas by lulav, maybe not. There's a whole movement by people at the end of the 19th century. There was a movement to try to reinstate shofar on Shabbat. It's relevant this year because we have the first day of Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbat. There's a movement to try to reinstate it. But you know, even nowadays, there's a movement by some people to try to reinstate it. We have court system, maybe. But anyway, the majority, we don't generally do it on Shabbat. Also, lulav we don't do on Shabbat. Again, it's a whole big sugya. I don't want to get into it here. So now we say, so it's to say lulav, if you want to say, maybe it means machshirei lulav. So lulav might be doche Shabbat, but not machshirei lulav. The Hatanya, but there's a brayta that says, lulav v'chol machshirav dochim et Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer. This is a fascinating halacha. According to Rabbi Eliezer, if you don't have a lulav on Shabbat, and it's the first day of Sukkot, you're allowed to do anything you need to get that lulav, basically. Okay? You can chop it off a tree if you need. Okay? You can basically do that, which is even more crazy as the next one. Okay? So basically, you can't say that's the case where he doesn't think so, because it says it explicitly in a brayta that he does. Maybe sukkah. Okay? Sukkah. Well, we know the mitzvah of sukkah doesn't even need to be doche Shabbat, right? Obviously, you can sit in a sukkah on Shabbat. But even building a sukkah, maybe he would say, oh, you can't build a sukkah on Shabbat. Well, the Hatanya, it says in a brayta, sukkah v'chol machshirei dochin et Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer. If you don't have a sukkah, sounds like according to Rabbi Eliezer, you can actually cut down trees to make schach. You can build your sukkah. Sounds like you can do anything to be able to become the mitzvah of sukkah on Shabbat. Okay, maybe you can't prepare matzah. Okay, you let's say cut the grains, prepare the flour, bake it, all that stuff. Again, v'hatanya, there's a brayta that says matzah v'chol machshirei dochin et Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer even thinks that's doche Shabbat. You need to eat matzah. You don't have matzah. You can bake matzahs on Shabbat. You can do anything to prepare your matzah. Ve'ela l'miutei shofar. What about shofar? V'hatanya, shofar v'chol machshirei dochin et Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer. Even by shofar, he thinks, right? You need to, let's say, prepare the shofar, make the hole in the shofar, fix it, whatever you need. You can do that also. So, Amar Rav bar Ava, what must it be? Finally, we get to our answer. You can't tie your tzitziot on Shabbat onto your bag, onto your clothing, or put up a mezuzah in your door, or let's say machshirei mezuzah would be more writing the parchment on the parchment for the mezuzah. That you can't do. Okay, that's where he draws the line. And then they say, sorry, I lost my place. Okay, 4 lines from the bottom. on Amud Aleph, Tanya Nami Hachi, there's a brighta to support this. Vishavin, okay, who's Shavin? Rabbi Eliezer, and who argues with him? Rabbi Akiva. Remember, Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah says, these machshavim are not tochesh Shabbat. Rabbi Akiva holds, no, you can't do any of these things on Shabbat. But they both agree, she'in tziyetz talitov asam zuzah lepitcho, if you tied your tzitzit or wrote your klaf for your mezuzah, shehu chayav. If you did it, okay, since these are not tochesh Shabbat, both agree that you're chayav midoraita. You'd have to bring a korban chatat. So what do you see here? Rabbi Eliezer basically holds that you can't, that these things are not tochesh Shabbat, okay? So there you have it. Those are the exceptions. So the Gemara asks a good question, which theoretically the Gemara doesn't need to ask, okay? But the Gemara asks, my taima, Amar Rav Yosef, and why are these different than all the rest? Now you could say very simply, and we're going to see later, the Gemara is going to prove each one from a special drasha. So you could simply say, there's no drasha for these. But the Gemara wants to say, what is inherently different between those two and all the rest? Amar Rav Yosef, ein kavua lehem zman. These are not specifically done in specific times. Matzah has to be done on Pesach, and Sukkah has to be done on Sukkah, and Lulav on the first day, right? Each of these has a special designated time. Because of that, they're going to be Dochesh Shabbat, just like Brit Milah. That's the obvious reason why Brit Milah is Dochesh Shabbat. Has to be done on the 8th day. So we're not going to only allow that. We're going to allow anything that makes that happen. You're sitting on Sukkah, you don't have a Sukkah, and you might think, just go to a neighbor, find a neighbor's Sukkah. But you have to eat in a Sukkah. You need a Sukkah. So we'll allow you to do whatever it takes to get that mitzvah done in its right time. But tzitzit on your beged and mezuzah on your door aren't time sensitive necessarily. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? I'm really Abaye questions Rav Yosef. It says, Adrabah, it's the reverse. Midain kavulam zman kol shata v'shata zmanehu. These happen. They're supposed to happen at every single moment. You need a mezuzah on your door all the time. You need tzitzit on your beged all the time. This is all the more so the machshavim should be dochesh Shabbat if you don't have it. El Amar of Nachman Amar of Yitzchak B'Tamer of Hunabraid Rav Yeshua. They give a different reason. Ho'ilu biyado kiran. Theoretically, you could just say this beged isn't mine, and then you wouldn't be obligated in tzitzit. Or you could say this house isn't mine. Say I'm giving up my house, giving up my rights to my house. We just saw today you could do that, right? You give up your rights for the eruv purposes. Give up the rights to your house. If you give up the rights to your house isn't yours. You're not chayav mezuzah. So theoretically, since there's a way out of these mitzvot, whereas the other mitzvot you can't get out of, you can't say, I don't want to live in my house, so I don't need to do a sukkah. You still need a sukkah, okay? Before we move on to the next section, I see someone asked a question about Gzera Shava. Can you just decide to do Gzera Shava? So this is actually a very important question because you're not allowed to just decide to do your own Gzera Shava. Gzera Shava is different from, let's say, a Kavachomer. Kavachomer, and to the extreme, there's even sugyot that mock people who make all sorts of Kavachomers. But, a logical argument, that's logical. Gzera Shava is something that only if you had a tradition about it, could you say Gzera Shava? Okay, it's not just something you could say, oh, there's a word, I'm going to put them together. Now the Gemara is going to go through each of these cases. Okay, that's the big chart at the end of the sheet that I made. Each of these cases, and it's going to say where do we learn in each of these cases, where did Rabbi Eliezer learn the machshirei dochim et HaShabbat? And then sometimes we'll try to say, well, what did the rabbis do with that? Because the rabbis didn't think that verse was coming to teach that. So what did they learn from that verse? Amar Mar. So now Amar Mar means we're going back to something we said previously. Lulav v'chol machshirav dochim et HaShabbat. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, that's the quote. Lulav and any preparation for the lulav can be dochesh Shabbat. Minale Rabbi Eliezer ha. Where does he get this from? Well, let's say, okay, we already learned it from the Omer and the Shtei Alechem. Let's learn from there to this case. Shekain tzorach gavoa. No, those are different. Why are those different? Because those are things that are done for a higher purpose, meaning they're done in the temple, right? Whereas lulav isn't necessarily only done in the temple. This actually, you have to wonder how this sugya works in with a particular approach about a lulav yavesh. When we get to a dry lulav, it's a whole question, why is it no good? And the Yerushalmi says, because lo ametim hallelujah. That the lulav is actually used as a way of praising God, and it's part of like a ritual of praying for God. And some people view it as if it's kind of in the level of kodesh, okay? This sugya would seem to say not, okay? And this is saying those are tzorach gavoa for God, and the rest of these mitzvot are not in that same category because they're not done in the mikdash. I mean, the lulav is taken in the mikdash, but it's also taken outside the mikdash, so it's different. Again, this is going to be the theme. Anytime something has a special, unique, either stringency or just some special niche, then we won't be able to learn from there to anything else, because we could say the reason why the machshirim or dochim Shabbat there is because of its special uniqueness, but that wouldn't necessarily apply to another case. Ela amar kra bayom. So the pasuk says, bayom harishon, you're supposed to bring the 4 minim, right? The lulav and everything else. What do we learn from here? Bayom va'afilu b'Shabbat. It's kind of like bayom hashmini, right? In the Brit Milah. On the 8th day, because it has to be done on the 8th day, therefore, it will be doche Shabbat. Likewise here, bayom afilu b'Shabbat. Now, what does it mean? How did we get from there to machshirim? That would just mean lulav is doche Shabbat, but not necessarily it's machshirim. So, lemay hilchata. Ilem a litiltul, if you want to say, now generally, items like a lulav or muktzah, there's no purpose to them, right? So maybe you'd say litiltul. Maybe it's coming to say you're allowed to pick up the lulav on Shabbat. It's not considered muktzah. And that's what the pasuk's telling you. That obviously can't be, though, because itzrich kra l'mishrei tiltul. You don't have a verse that comes to allow something muktzah because muktzah is only derabanan. So it's not a Torah law. So therefore, you don't have any verse specifically telling you, oh, you could go against a derabanan halacha. The derabanan didn't exist when the Torah was written. So that doesn't make any sense. Ela l'machshirav. It must be for the machshirim. Okay, so there they prove bayom is to teach you about the machshirim, that any preparations are allowed to be done in order to allow you to do it on that day. The Rabbanan, so what do the rabbis do if they don't hold by this? And this is the chart at the bottom of the page. Mibayle biyom v'lo balayla. They learn that you do the mitzvah of lulav during the day and not at night. That sounds good. Now, why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer need to learn that? So he can't because he just used bayom to teach you the machshirim. So Rabbi Eliezer, biyom v'lo balayla minale, where does he get it from? He gets it from the continuation of that verse. It says there, Nafkalemi v'samachtem l'fnei Hashem Elokechem shivat yamim. By the arba minim, the 4 species, it says you should be happy before God 7 days. What do you see again? Days, yamim v'lo leilot, and not nights. Now, so then you say, well, then the rabbis could have learned it from there, and then bayom is still free in the beginning. So why don't the rabbis learn it from there? For Rabbanan, itzrich. No, you need bayom in the beginning of the verse, and you couldn't have learned it from shivat yamim. Why? Because sal kadat hachamina, neilef shivat yamim is Sukkot. When it talks about sitting in the sukkah, it also says shivat yamim. And when it comes to taking the 4 species, it says 4 minim. It says yamim, shivat yamim, 7 days. So now think about sukkah. Are you chayav in sukkah also at night? Of course, you're supposed to sleep in your sukkah even. So neilef shivat yamim is sukkah. Ma lahalan yamim ba'afilu leilot, av kan yamim ba'afilu leilot. If you wanted to learn it from the Shivat Yamim like Rabbi Eliezer does, I don't think you can learn it from there because that Shivat Yamim matches the Shivat Yamim by Sukkah, and Sukkah happens even at night. So therefore, you might have thought this includes nighttime also, that you could take them at night. Kamash malan, that's what you needed Bayom according to the rabbis. Okay, so we have Rabbi Eliezer, he learned it from Bayom. We have the rabbis, they learn other things from Bayom. And in the end, we say, if we have Rabbi Eliezer, that he learns from Bayom, Machshirei Milah, so once we have the drasha by lulav, why didn't we understand the other cases, shtei alechem and the omer or tzorach gavoah? But theoretically, then we could have learned from lulav to them. If for lulav, then all the more so for them. And we didn't need a special drasha by them, by those cases. So what do they answer? Mishum de'ika lemifrach. Again, we're going to say lulav has its own unique element that isn't in the others, right? They're unique because they're tzorach gavoah. This is unique because Malilulav Shekain Te'un Arba'a Minim. Where do you have a mitzvah that needs 4 parts that have to be taken all together all at the same time? Like theoretically, Shtei Alechem goes with 2 kvasim. There are different parts to it, but this is they all have to happen together at the same time. In order to do the mitzvah, you have to put these 4 things together. That's a unique element. From there, we can't learn from there to the other cases. Okay, moving on. Now we want to get to the next case. Sukkah. Minale Rabbi Eliezer, how? Where does he get the sukkah? Preparations for sukkah are allowed to be done on Shabbat. Again, where this is like when you're going on a trip and you're bringing an apple and then a banana and then everybody repeats all the previous ones. So this is what we're going to do. Okay, we can't learn it from there because they are special because they're done in the Beit HaMikdash. We just said what was unique by lulav. You can't learn from lulav to sukkah because there's 4 things that are brought together. It's got unique halachas. Let's learn it from the exact Shivat Yamim that we said appear by Sukkah and Lulav. And because of that, the rabbis didn't want to learn from there because you might have thought it applies at night. Well, let's learn the reverse direction. Once we learn Lulav, we're going to learn from there to Sukkah because both say Shivat Yamim. Just like by Lulav, preparations can push off Shabbat. Okay, so now they go to the question we just asked. This is a very clear structure because it keeps repeating itself. It makes it good when you're doing Daf Yomi and a whole long daf all at once. There's a lot of repetition and the structure is repeated. So why didn't they just have it by Sukkah? And from Sukkah, we could have learned all the others because it's not Zorach Gavoa, it's not 4 minim, V'nei Tehanach, and we need more minim. We could have learned all the rest from there. Not really. Mishum de'ika lemifrach, ma v'sukkah shekenu hege balilot keviyamim. Sukkah has a unique element that it applies also at night, not only during the day, and all the others, the sacrifices all have to happen during the day, and the lulav is only during the day. So you might have said, because it's at night, maybe that's why machshirei dochin et Shabbat, and therefore couldn't learn to anything else. Moving along to the next case. Where do we get this from? So here goes our mantra. Right? It's unique because it's in the Mikdash. We can't learn it from there. Needs 4 minim. You have to do it at night like during the day. How do they learn it? By Sukkot, it's on the 15th of the month, and it says Chamishasar. And by Pesach, it says B'Chamishasar. So we learn Ma Lahalan, just like by Sukkot, Machshirei Dochin et HaShabbat, Av Kam Machshirei Dochin et HaShabbat. So again, we learn Sukkah from Lulav, and then we learn Matzah from Sukkah, or from all those Sukkah-related mitzvot, which is Sukkah and Lulav. So now they say, V'lichtav Rachmana b'matzah, V'nei tehanach v'ligmar minei. Can't do that because D'ikal Mifrach, Ma La Matzah Shekenu Hege B'nashim K'B'anashim. Matzah applies to men and women. That's because matzah has 2 sides. It's got an as and a lo taseh. You can't eat leavened bread. You have to eat matzah. Women can't eat leavened bread. They also, therefore, have to eat matzah. So they're part of the mitzvah and not the same. Sukkah, they're exempt. Lulav, they're exempt. Shtei Alechem in general, right? They don't generally deal with sacrifices. So they're exempt from all the other mitzvot. And that's why matzah has a unique halacha about it that you wouldn't be able to learn from there to anything else. Shofar, v'chomach shirav dochin et HaShabbat, divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So again, min na'alei l'Rabbi Eliezer ha. Ime omer b'shtei alechem, can't learn it from there, shekein tzorach gavoa. Imi lulav, shekein te'unar ra'aminim. Imi sukkah, shekein ohega balelo kibiyamim, right, night and day. Imi matzah, shekein ohega b'nashim kib'anashim. Both men and women. It's actually a whole thing about shofar, right? Women nowadays do keep the mitzvah of shofar, but theoretically they're exempt. It's just that there was a minhag. Sometimes minhag overrides halacha. The minhag became halacha. The women now are very careful about hearing shofar, more so than other of the mitzvot that women are exempt from, the time-bound mitzvot. But theoretically, from the basic law, women are actually exempt from shofar. So how do we learn shofar? El Amakra, Yom Trua Yelachem. This should be for you a day of Trua. Again, we're going to learn from Yom, by Yom Afilu b'Shabbat. You have to do it during that day, and therefore, even on Shabbat, you can do it. Now, again, Ulamai. How do we know this is talking about machshirim? Maybe this means just to blow the shofar, you can do it on that day. If it's to blow Hatana de Shmuel, it's a chokhmah to be able to do it. It's not a malacha. You have to be an expert, but it doesn't take any work. And therefore, it's not considered work. Therefore, for sure, shofar is doche Shabbat. The word yom tshu'ah must become and teach you something additional. Ela l'machshirim. That preparations. Rabbanan, what are Rabbanan? This is exactly what we saw before. What do they do with that verse? They tell you that shofar is during the day and not at night. Where does he learn by Yom V'lo B'layla? They learn from on Yom Kippur once every 50 years in the Yovel, the Jubilee year. They will blow the shofar on Yom Kippurim, and there it says Bayom, there it's Bayom, and it comes to say, right, and not Balayla. That's what Rabbi Eliezer learns about the shofar. Rosh Hashanah is like the shofar we do Yom Kippur once every 50 years, and we get it from there. So now they say V'gamrei mehadade, okay, and we learn one from the other. Final question, why don't we learn from shofar to everything else? V'ligmaru minei mitzkiat shofar de Rosh Hashanah. V'ligmaru minei. So they say, well, mitzkiat shofar de Rosh Hashanah you can't learn. Leika lemigmar. Why? Because again, what's unique about the shofar of Rosh Hashanah? Shekei machneset zichronot shel Yisrael avihen shebashamayim. Very interesting, right? They say there's something incredibly unique about the shofar, that it reminds God about remembering us, okay? It's basically bringing our zichronot, who we are, to God. That's something incredibly unique. Therefore, you can't learn that from anything else. And mitkiat shofar de Yom Kippurim leika lemigmar. Tamar tik'u beitin shofar What does the shofar blow on Yom Kippur, the Jubilee year, do? It basically, when you blow that shofar, all the slaves go free, all the land goes back to its original owners, or the land that's supposed to go back to their original owners, the one that are Beit Achuzah. If you remember all that, we learned it in Nida. Anyway, basically, it's a unique shofar blow that causes all sorts of things to happen, and that's why it's going to be Doches Shabbat, but it doesn't necessarily mean everything else will be, and that's why everything needed its own unique halacha. That will finish for today. Have a great day, everybody.